Mistake number 1 is pretty obvious. Make sure that you don't try and pick up your pieces before you've quenched them, or you're gonna burn yourself. Mistake number 2 is holding your torch in your dominant hand. It may seem like the natural thing and what we want to do, but what you actually should be doing is holding your torch in your less dominant hand. So for me, I'm right-handed, so I hold my torch in my left hand. The reason is I want to be holding my probe in my right hand so that I can adjust things carefully if anything shifts, which it often does, while we solder. Mistake number 3 is not using the torch correctly. So when you first start soldering, you want to heat it from a distance so that the solder can gently start to dry without bubbling like absolute craziness. So once it has heated up to a point where the flux gets sticky, then you can come in a little bit more, and then when it starts to get to the right temperature, then you use the tip of the blue flame, which is the hottest part, to focus on the solder, and then it will flow. Voila, like that. Mistake number 4 is overheating your piece. So once it starts to go, as soon as the solder has flowed, you need to remove the heat instantly, because if it goes too orange, then you're going to damage your metal. Mistake number 5 is thinking that solder fills gaps and having poor alignment on your piece, and also not having enough tension between the two sides pushing together. So as you can see here, this piece has not been filed correctly. There are gaps, you can see the light between the two, and there isn't a good connection. Additionally to that, even if you had done it correctly, you want to make sure that there's not a gap between here. So what I do is I push it overlapping like this so that it's got some memory of being pushed tight together, and then click it on. You kind of have to wiggle and jiggle so that it sits in alignment with the other side, but you want to make sure that that's nice and tight between the two sides, pushing towards each other. That. So I'm going to try and solder this now, even though we know it's got a bad connection. So let's see what happens. Grab a piece of solder. So if I was soldering this join, and it was normal, this is the size of solder I would be using. So let's replicate that by using the same amount. If I can pick it up. There we go. Let's pop that there. Quench first. So let's have a look at it and see. And what do you know? Didn't solder. So that's because there wasn't enough of it touching with enough tension between the two sides. Mistake number 6 is not heating up your piece evenly. So what happens is if you heat up one side of a ring, for example, a lot more than the other side, then the solder is going to jump to the side that is hot and you won't have a good join. So let's see how that looks. So this one, unlike the other one, I've made the join very well, so that is not going to be the issue here. It's purely going to be about heating up one side only and not the other side of the ring. So it's getting hot and the solder flow. Did you see it shine over there? And let's have a look. Quench it first. So let's have a look. So just taking it out of water and it did not solder. And if we look around, we'll see the solder is sitting here all on this side of the piece here only. So that is because I didn't heat up this side at all and I was just focusing my heat on this side. So that will not join even if you have a beautifully filed join. Mistake number 7 is making your flux way too watery. That is obviously, of course, if you're using the borax cone like I am here, and you add way too much water, like this, then what's going to happen is you're going to see, so I have a join over there, I'm putting loads on here and it's really watery. If you go straight in to solder this now, look what's going to happen. So here I have very watery flux and on my solders on top. So what happens is if you have a lot of water, it's going to bubble a lot and your solder's going to go all over the show. See where it's ended up over there? It becomes very sticky, you can't rearrange it very easily, and it becomes a bit of a mess to work with. Mistake number 7 is not using the correct solder for the job. So you have got 3 different types of solder for silver, which is easy, medium and hard. Same goes for gold, easy, medium, hard. The reason you have 3 different types is because you want to use different solders if you have a lot of joins in a piece. So what you would do is you'd start off with a hard solder, which melts at a higher temperature than the silver, which also melts at a higher temperature than the medium, and the medium melts at a higher temperature than the easy. You'd start off with a hard solder for your initial joins, then you'd move to the medium, and then you would use the easy on your last solder joins. The reason for this is that the solder joins you made before are not going to open up when you reheat the piece again and again for the different joints. Mistake number 9 is using way more solder than you possibly need. I know we think that solder is going to make it a really strong join and make the piece even more secure, but what actually ends up happening is that you end up putting way too much and that leaves big bumps of solder when you're finished, and that just is going to give you a whole lot more work to clean up afterwards. So you're going to need to file all of that down completely flush and make sure that none of the solder is actually showing, because as we know, solder is an alloy, so it's not a pure silver. So over time it'll change color, so it'll kind of go a greeny yellow sort of color. So you don't want to be seeing big lumps of that on your finished piece of jewelry. So make sure that you can't see any at all. So it really helps to sometimes hold the piece at different lights to catch it where it was, because initially it's going to look like silver, but as time goes it's going to change color. So save yourself some time by just using as little as you possibly can get away with. Solder is pretty damn strong, so you really don't need a lot. So here, yes, I may have gone slightly overboard, but I just want to show you what happens when there's too much solder. And it's definitely not necessary to put anywhere near as much as this. Like I would put a third of this basically, and only on one side. So I've basically put 6 times too much, and even the pieces I used are quite chunky. So really you don't need a lot of solder at all. So it's going to flow all over the show. So that flowed on one side, and so first of all, you don't need to put solder on both sides. You can just put it on the one side, and really not much needed at all. So as you can see here, there is loads of solder that we'll need to file away. So it's like raised and a big bump, and you can see it over there. So obviously right now it's the same color as the silver, but with time that will go a yellowy kind of greeny color. So yeah, just avoid having excess solder. Mistake number 10, last but not least, is let's not overcomplicate our lives. I know that some solder setups can be very fiddly and tricky, and they need to be, but some of them really don't need to be. So make sure that you are working smart and not hard, and try and find a simple way of doing something. Sometimes it can be actually quite easy. For example, this is the way I used to solder ear pins. So I'd put my flux on there, I could put my pin in my third arm, I would paint the flux on there, then I would grab myself a piece of solder from here, try and position it carefully where I want it to go with shaking hands, then the nightmare of trying to balance it, Try and balance it, get everything all lined up. Make sure this is straight, not wipe off the flux in the meantime. Balance it on there, and like, depends how hungry I am, shaky hands, balance it on there. Make sure that it sits nice and carefully. And then I would solder that. And make sure that I push down on there. Let me show you a simpler way. So what you're gonna do, flux your piece, grab your third arm freely, trust me. Then you're gonna grab your torch, your piece of solder is just here on your block. Switch on your torch, grab your piece in your hand here, and then you're going to sweat solder your solder onto the tip of your piece so it just sticks there. Hold it, position, make sure you're focusing the heat on the bottom, so on the earring, not on the stick, on the post, and voila, there you go. Way less fiddly. So I hope you enjoyed this. Let me just chuck that in there. So there are your top 10 tips for things not to do when soldering as a beginner. I hope this was helpful, and I look forward to seeing you next week in another video. Take care. Bye. Mistake number 1 is kicking your shit behind you. Mistake number 1 is trying to pick up your peaches. Peaches.